Welcome to IT Pro TV. I'm your host, Don.
Coming at you live from San Francisco, California.
You're watching IT Pro TV.
Hello, and welcome back to another exciting edition of IT Pro TV. I'm your host, Vaughn Smith, and this is our Cisco Cloud Fundamentals series. And in this episode, we're going to take a look at our cloud service models. And in particular, we're going to look at the infrastructure as a service model. And here is Mr. Ronnie Wong to help us. How are you today?
I'm doing well, Vaughn. Thank you for joining me once again on the show as we continue to move forward through the idea here of Cisco's Cloud Fundamental series. And remember that what we're in, Vaughn, as far as the beginning here, right, is that we're not really getting super specific with any Cisco technology into itself. We will get into that portion of it. But right now, we're just reviewing the basic aspects of understanding the idea of cloud technology itself and the concepts really right now. And then we'll jump into that a little bit more as we go through.
And these are good definitions to review and really kind of emphasize because, of course, this is all testable material. Right. And these types of exams, at least the exams that I have taken, they like to talk about the definitions, and they will quiz you on this.
Yeah, and once again, Cisco's kind of really known for this, right? They don't try and make it overly complicated, but they do make it where with the time that you have in terms of limitations of time, that's really kind of the big challenge here, is that you can actually take a look at the idea of what they're asking you, and if they give you 4 or 5 answers here, to be able to pick it and to move on quickly, because remember with Cisco types of exams, you don't have this chance that once you actually click on, yeah, that wasn't the right answer. You don't have to go back. You just have to continue to move forward. So you only get one pass through it. So that's why it's very important that you pay attention to definitions. Make sure you're taking your notes and making sure that you actually do verify that all these answers I'm giving you is correct, because I can say stupid things at times, and I've done it before. So just kind of realize that, yes, it is your responsibility, but this is also part of what we're going to do to make sure that we get it right.
And I'll be completely honest with you on some of this stuff when I'm starting to study for a new test. I kind of skip over the introduction stuff. Sure. You know, it's like, oh, I already know that. And then you get back into some of like the meat, and then you realize like, wait, I think I'm missing like a basic concept. Right. And so that's why we're spending a good amount of time reviewing this. So you don't just write down the definition and kind of move on. You really need to kind of understand this as a whole, because it's important not just in real life, but for the test as well.
Yeah, and you make a good point here, Vaughn. The very fact is all of us may have learned these definitions a little bit, the way that we learned them. In other words, we pick them up depending on where we're working and what they're going to do. But what we want to focus in on, since you're taking a Cisco exam, is that we understand from their standpoint. In other words, using their terminology, and I'm not going to say it's their definitions because a lot of it's mine, but I try to make it more aligned with the way that Cisco would define these things so that you can kind of understand it from that standpoint as well. So making sure you understand from the Cisco terminology, because you may have learned something through another cloud provider and go, oh, but that's called this, and Cisco calls it something different. I'll try and make those equivalencies so that you can understand that. But overall, though, what Vaughn is mentioning is easy. You go, oh, I know what the definition of that is, but you might not actually understand the way that Cisco approaches it, so make sure you understand it from that point too.
Yeah, that's a huge one. I mean, I know since studying for the ITIL, and even just like in general knowledge, I'm like, oh, a problem and incident is the same thing. They are not. Yeah. They are completely different. And so what you think you might know, you don't know in the eyes of whatever testing body or governing body that you are actually going into. So just know, sometimes it might vary a little bit in real life, but we're talking about test preparation and just knowing what it is in the eyes of Cisco.
Yeah, essentially, generically, right? They're all the same. They're talking about the same thing. We just describe them differently. So let's make sure that we get started back on the right page when we start talking about the idea of these cloud service models that we're talking about. And for Cisco, it always comes back to one central starting point in terms of the way that they develop their technology and their understanding of the cloud, which is going to be that NIST documentation, NIST SP, or Special Publication 800-145. I've got that pulled up on my screen because it's going to be important for what we're going to be doing here, which we've been talking about. Remember that the overall definition of cloud computing that we've talked about, make sure you review that. I know I'm not going to actually read it again because I've already read it through a couple of times during our series so far. But remember that the idea of cloud computing is not so much helping you to understand all the underlying technologies, but the way that the way that Cisco actually approaches it here, right, is the idea that cloud computing essentially describes a model, okay, is what it actually describes here. Now, when we talk about that overall description of model, well, the model itself can be broken down into, well, different components, right? So remember that the model itself is actually composed of some different things. We've reviewed the 5 essential characteristics already of that cloud computing model. And you're going, all right, you're going to list these for us, right? No, because I'm going to make you go back and watch those, or you're going to take a look at this document and you see them right under here. So I'm not going to read them all out to you, but you can actually see them right here. And you can, of course, download this material for yourself as well, so that you have access to that. Now, if you're an IT Pro TV subscriber, okay, so if you're actually watching it as an IT Pro TV member, this will be part of the essential downloads that I've done this for. And the reason why is that during the time, like I said, as the preparations for this episode was going on, I had downloaded this right before the actual government shutdown. And I don't know if there's a government shutdown that's going to be happening again. So in other words, if you're actually watching this while there's a government shutdown, go, oh, I can't go and get that document. Well, you'll have it right here as an IT Pro TV subscriber. So it's freely available. I'm not doing something illegal here. It's not copyright or anything, but you will have that as part of the downloads is what you want to know. So just kind of realize that's a big part. But what we're going to, though, Vaughn, is right here where we talk about the idea of 3 service models. And, of course, there are 4 deployment models. And this is where it gets a little bit confusing, Vaughn, is that most of the time, especially in the way that we might have actually learned about the idea of cloud services, these two get intermingled very easily. And the definitions kind of get, where you're like, oh, no, let's talk about this and not this. So you're not exactly sure what we're talking about here, okay? So we want to spend some time so that we can differentiate the idea between what a service model is versus the idea of a deployment model as well. But then we want to spend some time and taking a look at each of these 3 service models is what we want to do. So I'm just going to give a summarization, and we'll see it in details as we go through here. But when we start talking about the differences between the service model versus the deployment model, okay, the service model essentially is for the person that is going to be building that cloud or already has the cloud itself, okay? And what I mean by that is that they're probably the provider of that cloud. So they're a cloud provider of some sort is what they are really dependent on. And what I mean by that is that they're saying, here is what I already have, and now what do I want to offer to my customers here, okay? So they actually can say, hey, look, we're going to actually be an infrastructure as a service model, or a platform as a service, or the idea here of software as a service, right? So that is what we call a service model, right? They're actually the services that are provided to us. The idea of the deployment model is simple. This is from the standpoint of the individual consumer or customer or tenant, if you want to call it that. And they actually can get access to, well, different ones. And you've heard those particular terminologies before as well, okay? Hybrid, what can I remember? Public, yeah, private, and community. All these are actually the ways that we also attach to those things too. So that's kind of what we're taking a look at in just a general sense here, okay? So let's go ahead and we'll take a look at the idea of these service models, and we'll divide them up. So inside of that NIST documentation, they describe these 3 service models. Now, when I say this, everybody's going to say, but what about this and what about this other thing? Well, there's coming to this point, Vaughn, especially in cloud technologies, where we're going to actually have where it's going to be anything that you can think of as a service, okay? And I literally mean that. So many different models have actually come out recently, where there's essentially like desktop as a service now. There's a bunch of other things as a service. You name it, it's everything that's actually out there that's available to you, and you realize it. But when it comes down to the way that Cisco's going to test you, they're really going to focus in on these 3 models.
Yeah, because in general, you think everything's under service, like
Right.
the desktop. So, but again, we got to be very specific on what this particular organization is wanting us to
Right.
do our classifications as.
Yeah, because we can always split this and continue to do more as we get more familiar and more comfortable with it. These are not the only models that are out there really now that they've kind of developed since this point in time when this document was made. But these are the ones that are going to be heavily testable on the actual exam that you're facing for the actual 210-451 exam, okay? So let's take a look. We're going to actually spend some time in this idea of infrastructure as a service. Now, notice the acronym for that, because you'll probably see both. You don't have to memorize the acronym, but just kind of make sure you understand what it means, right? Infrastructure as a service, or IaaS, and it's pronounced in many different ways. Everybody pronounces it as IaaS, is what I normally say it as. But notice what they're talking about here. Capabilities provided to a consumer is to provision processing, storage, and networks and other fundamental computing resources where the customer is able to deploy and run arbitrary software, which can include operating systems and applications. Okay? The consumer itself does not manage or control the underlying cloud infrastructure, but has control over the operating system, storage, and deployed applications, possibly limited control of select networking components is what they're talking about. Now, all of a sudden you're like, wow, that's a whole mouthful. It's so big. What are they really saying here? Well, the easiest way to understand this is I'm going to bring up a graphic instead so that we can take a look at the way that I've actually tried to define it for us, which essentially is right here. Now, Vaughn, I've broken this down into two different categories. Over on the right-hand side, you'll see the category, which is what is the cloud provider's responsibility, okay? And then what is the customer's responsibility when they're accessing the cloud model? So notice here, Vaughn, as the idea of the infrastructure as a service, essentially the provider itself is saying, here's what we are going to provide for you, Vaughn, as the customer, is that we're going to provide for you virtualized things, okay? And that idea of virtualized things that we're talking about, okay, technically they call it the idea here of partitioning. So they'll say, Vaughn, we're going to actually give you your own partitioning abilities. You know, well, I don't know what that actually means. Well, what that means, Vaughn, are what we call virtual machines or virtual servers, virtualized servers. So you don't actually get your own hardware per se, even though you might be able to, but what you get is actually virtualized servers. And so that's the term partitioning. What you're doing there is you're taking whatever resource and you're dividing it up into, well, individual computers is what you're doing for the virtual machines. The idea of storage, okay, or pooling is what they call it. Now, when we talk about the idea of pooling, what we're saying is, Vaughn, with those servers, I can also grant you certain size hard drives, okay? Well, in that sense, it doesn't mean that the service provider, every time Vaughn goes, oh, I need a 10 terabyte hard drive size, or I need 60 gigabytes or whatever it is, right? That they simply go out and buy these hard drives and put them in there. They've already, in the background, Vaughn, pooled all of those resources together, and now they can subdivide that up and give you access to what you're actually saying that you need to. So they call the idea of storage a lot of times in the most basic unit, the idea of pooling as well. So we have partitioning, we have pooling, and then the last one here is what we call abstraction. So let's take a look at my model again, and this will help us out too. And that is about the network services here. Now, Vaughn, you've actually seen, you know, the way that we've run networking, cabling and everything throughout our building here too. And you've also, of course, know all the different components that are actually inside of our networking room that we have. There's a lot of different devices that are there, okay? Vaughn, as a service provider, guess what? Somebody like AWS, they don't have just me as a customer, and they're not just, you know, having to bring in new machines and plug them in and run all the cables for them and do all that. What they're saying is, look, we've already networked this or all of my devices together in a way, but we can also abstract that. Now, that's a weird word, isn't it, Vaughn? Okay, the term abstraction here, it looks weird, doesn't it?
Well, yeah, and I wanted to just do a quick question. These words, partitioning, pooling, these are words that they are going to use, because to me,
right.
Yeah, I know what a server and storage and network. I mean, that's what we do when we build things to connect us. But I'm not used to seeing them as like partitioning. That makes sense. Pooling made sense, but yeah, abstraction, that one, I'm a little...
Yeah.
Why?
Okay, well, the reason why is because we don't actually get individual pieces of our networking hardware. So, for example, in the cloud as an infrastructure, Vaughn, you're not assigned your own switch or your own router in this sense, right? But what they do is that they virtualize it to where you think that you're working with a switch, but you're really working with software that is actually acting like a switch, okay? You're working with software that actually allows you to configure it as a firewall or as a router, okay? And it handles that for you. So you're not getting access to real networking equipment. They've abstracted, in other words, hidden the complexity behind the way that they've actually done all this. But you and I work with it as if they're actually our own devices, okay? So hence that idea of abstraction. Abstraction just means I'm hiding all of the technical details behind it, but Vaughn, you can work with it as you normally would have at any other day, okay? Now, these terms that we're talking about here, right, you actually see them in different ways depending on the actual vendor that comes out with this, but that's what we have here, okay? And so virtualization and all these things are pretty much the responsibility of the provider itself. The other parts, though, from that point on, is the customer's responsibility. So notice we talk about operating system here. So it could be where you go ahead and you bring up your partitioning, which is a virtualized server. But Vaughn, It may not mean that I've already got an operating system installed on it as a provider, okay? But it may mean where you actually provide that for us, or you actually provide the license for us. And if we have a template, then you get access to that. So you pay for that, or you're actually responsible for that operating system. Also, any other additional software that you have to run for your own infrastructure inside of your network, you would do the same thing. So for example, the idea of a DNS server, you'd actually provide that, or DHCP, you would provide all that. You'd actually be the one to do that. And then any other applications you want to run as your own, that's all up to you, but this also means something else, Vaughn, okay? The provider itself is not going to take care of if you misconfigured stuff. If you actually go to them, they'll say, well, no, I show that you have actually got your virtualized server. You are using this much storage. The network, as far as the way that we've got it set up, actually can reach the internet or can reach your partner the way that it says it can, okay? So the rest is up to you, and now you have to be the one to be able to actually manage that on your own.
This is a great diagram of just how this all works. And I know, just kind of relating back to some of the things that I've been studying, is the service is the co-creation of value. There's two parts. There is the provider, and then there's the customer. We talk about these different examples of like a car, right? You can go, the person or company creates the car, puts it on the lot, but you have to be able to drive it. You have to have your driver's license to be able to operate that vehicle. And so it works both ways. So there is that customer responsibility to that service that you must partake in for it all to work. And if you don't have the driver's license, then you can't drive, technically you can't drive the car. Or if you don't know how to drive stick shift, then it's like, well, we gave you a stick shift, but you don't know how to drive it. That's on you. That's on you, not on us.
Right. So this clearly separates that out. And in the realm of cloud services, right, the different models that we have, it is about the responsibility of who's responsible for what, okay, is what we're seeing. Now, there's a term that I forgot to mention, but I wanted to mention it now because I just looked down and realized, I got to bring that term in here. So let's take a look at my screen again. I've just typed it out here. So Vaughn, there is a term that we call collateral effect is what we have here, okay? So when you talk about this idea, and underneath this bar where I have virtualization, remember that all of these devices are essentially virtualized here, okay? So they're saying that any of these that Vaughn chooses to bring up as a customer, right? If she chooses, to actually do a virtualized server, if she chooses whatever size hard drive she needs, however it actually needs to be configured, okay? She chooses to actually configure her own router switches and connect them the way that they want to be connected, that's perfectly fine. But the idea of the collateral effect is simple, is that Vaughn, if you choose to do this, the underlying infrastructure that the cloud provider is actually providing for us hides the technicality in how they do it, okay? So you're working with what is representative in terms of the virtualization, but the way that it actually works in the background, they're hiding it from you, so you're actually doing a collateral effect here. You're actually manipulating software. The cloud provider is actually saying, all right, I can get this to work together. I'm going to hide all the details behind that so Vaughn doesn't have to worry, is it cabled correctly? Does she have enough storage here in terms of adding in additional hard drives or doing that? Or does she have access to her server? They actually do it. Okay? And so that's the idea of also understanding the idea of collateral effect here. Okay? Now, there are a couple of challenges in terms of infrastructure as a service that we also need to be aware of. So as good as this sounds, Vaughn, the other thing that also is challenging here is what we call application security, okay? So right up here, and the reason why is, Vaughn, is because customer responsibility, right? And that means that, Vaughn, if you actually deploy this for your team or for your company, you have to be responsible for what? For the security behind all of this here. That means updates that have to go on in each of these layers that have to do that. If you choose not to, and it's connected out to the world, right, to the internet at some point, that means you can have a possibility where it can bring down your infrastructure if you get ransomware or some type of malware that's on your computer. And that's something you got to worry about. So that is a challenge that the provider says, well, we gave you the service, so it's up to you to take care of the rest. You just got to be aware.
That's the end user security, like making sure you're not clicking on the phishing links and then, signing up for accounts that you're not supposed to. And that takes a little bit of training. And also how you're setting up all like the yellow part, if you want to say, to make sure that it doesn't get passed down into the blue.
Correct. Yeah, so that's all part of that too, okay? Now, the other thing that we also have to make sure that we understand here is that the challenge for the provider is also what we call multi-tenancy. And that's when they start actually having more than one customer. And the reason why is that Vaughn, in the end of it, right, if they get to that point where they go, look, we can't handle any more customers, they literally have to rebuild, or not rebuild, but add into their additional infrastructure more and more, okay, so they can handle more and more customers. So that usually, again, raises expenses sometimes, not all the time. But overall, though, it does provide that idea that it is a challenge in terms of the infrastructure build that a cloud provider would have to have, right? Now, Vaughn, before we go on, I do want to take at least a little bit of time here in this episode, since we're focusing in on infrastructure as a service, to show you an example of infrastructure as a service as well. And one of the biggest, actually, I'm going to say it's the biggest gorilla, okay, the 800-pound gorilla in the actual room here is going to be what we call AWS, Amazon Web Services here, okay? So for those of you that are part of the American Welding Society, that's not what I mean, okay? It's Amazon Web Services is what I'm talking about. So AWS is by far probably the biggest player in the market at this point, and they've even branched out over time. Originally, they only provided what I was showing you, which was the infrastructure as a service. Now, for those of you that go, man, I don't have access to AWS here, you can. You can actually go ahead and subscribe to their free tier, and that will give you access to be able to poke around and to see some of these things. You just got to be careful about what you actually leave. Make sure there's always a little flag on certain things that when you do this, it says free tier, select those things, and then immediately once you're done, delete them. Okay, in other words, turn them off. But overall, though, we want to show you some of the things when we talk about the idea of infrastructure as a service and what it has. So the AWS Management Console, when you go ahead and get into it, okay, that is just kind of one of the selections that I had, and you can see here's a history of all of the actual services that are available, and there's quite a few. We're not going to jump into every single one, but you can see that it goes from everything: business applications, analytics, robotics, blockchain, satellite. So Vaughn, I can even control satellite software that's actually out there, build my ground station port. Yeah, you name it, you can actually control that through your cloud service now.
That sounds a little scary.
It is, isn't it? Yeah. Internet of Things, you name it, there's a ton of them, okay? But let's talk about the idea of what we talked about, okay? So let's go back to that original idea here, okay, of that partitioning, which is going to be, of course, server virtualization. Well, underneath in Amazon, they call it compute, okay? So the idea of partitioning, for Amazon, they call it computing. And one of the easiest ones here is EC2, okay? And that stands for the Elastic Compute Cloud is what it stands for. And this idea of the Elastic Compute Cloud will allow you to build your own virtualized server. So notice that Amazon didn't say, oh, here's the servers, Vaughn, you can use it right away. It's from here that you can go ahead and launch an instance, and now you get to choose what image you want to put, in other words, what operating system you want it to run, and you can actually see some of this stuff here. And this is what I mean. Notice it says free tier eligible, okay? So if you're actually in that free tier, you can actually choose something like this.
And we're talking about server software, because we're still in the blue right now.
Yeah, we're still actually, well, to a point, right? We're actually where we're starting to provision or starting to partition what we've actually been assigned as a space in terms of what we want, okay? So yeah, to a point here, they're saying here's the actual partitioning side. Now, when we start to actually interact with it like what I'm doing, that is my responsibility, okay? So I'm selecting. So here I am as the actual consumer selecting that, and here is the other option. Notice that I can now pick the actual type, and it shows me that this one's T2 micro, variable ECUs, 1 VPU, 2.5 gigahertz Xeon family, 1 gigabit or gigabit of memory, EBS only. You name it, you're actually selecting this, and then you go down, you start paying for it, is what you start to do.
We're setting up our server right now.
We're setting up our server.
So that's what we're doing. We're still, okay. That's where, when you said operating system, I got a little like, wait, did we just jump into the, I'm thinking about the diagram.
Yeah.
Like the yellow, but this is more on the blue side. We're setting up that server.
The blue side is the idea where they say compute, but when I set it up, I'm actually moving into the yellow now.
Okay.
Yeah. So I'm actually in that yellow portion where I'm saying, hey, this is how I want to decide to partition it.
This is how you're going to be interacting with the server.
Right, yeah. And then in the lower right corner, there's a button that says configuration, then the next detail. And from this point here, I can now go ahead and just start moving through. And I'm not going to do all this because I'm going to run out of time here very quickly if I don't, okay? But I did want to show you that you just go ahead and you configure that, and that continues to allow you to do the rest of this if you want to. So I'm not so worried about that. But you can see right there, that's actually the compute side of things when you start to do that. Now, once you get into that idea of the compute side and you go back in, you can also see that there's some other things here, such as what we call load balancers, okay? So load balancers are now underneath that idea of the compute or underneath the partitioning as well. That now if I want to, I can group together a bunch of different servers. Instead of taxing one server, I can actually go ahead and have them load balance between that. And you and I don't have to set up the load balancer. It can just happen and do what we actually need it to do, okay? So that is another portion of something that we can actually take a look at and do as well, okay? So in that sense here, in terms of the way that we're actually looking at partitioning right now, that idea of load balancing, of simply building up our servers, that is our interaction and what we're doing. So we've got the cloud infrastructure in the background from AWS to actually help us out here. But there's some other things that we can also take a look at too in our brief time that we have. Notice here storage. Remember when we talked about the idea of pooling, okay? Pooling, well, here in AWS is called storage, is what it's called, okay? So for us, there's actually something called S3. S3 stands for Simple Storage Service, 3 S's, okay? Simple Storage Services. And they don't call them disk, what they call the idea here of simple storage services, even though it's actually about the idea of hard drives, they call those buckets. So they don't call them hard drives, they don't call them, disk drives here. They call them buckets is what they do. And this is what you can do. You can actually create your own size bucket if you want to. So if I click on that, and now I simply follow down through here, and I have my configuration options. I set permissions. You name it, we can go ahead and configure that. Now, we're not going through an Amazon, class here or anything like that. So I just want to show you that that's an example of like the idea here of resource pooling. And there's a bunch of other things that you can have here as well. And it just depends on what you need. And then there's also what they call the elastic block storage. We didn't see that right here. It's actually kind of hidden away, not in this main menu. But elastic block storage is another thing that can actually be out there for you that you can get access to. But you do see EFS here, which is the elastic file system. So block storage is not about the way that we access individual files. It's about the way that we store data, okay? Elastic file system says, hey, provides a file storage to use with our EC2 instances. So this is how we can attach additional drives to our EC2 instance if we want to. So that is saying, here's how big I want that S3 bucket to be, and then here's the elastic file system. I can actually use that as well. And then, well, let's go all the way down here to networking and content delivery, okay? So that last part on abstraction.
That's the abstraction,
Yep.
yes.
So that's what we're taking a look at. So network and content delivery is that abstraction layer. And when you start to do this, right, Vaughn, if there's multiple customers that Amazon is hosting, and they've got probably millions of customers, okay? So if they do this, Vaughn, I don't want my particular traffic intermingling with anybody else's traffic. Well, that means you have to be able to create your own network inside of their gigantic network that they have. The way you do that is by doing what we call VPC, okay? VPC here is going to be your virtual private cloud or something like that. I can't remember yeah, virtual private cloud. I always get the terms mixed up because I always think about virtual PC is what I think about. So the virtual private cloud is essentially you building your own private cloud network, your own networking infrastructure. And from that point, you can create your own subnets. You can do routing, internet gateways, you name it. You can even have ACLs, create virtual private networks. All of this is actually kind of a big one that you can also have available to you, okay? And the other one that they specifically do call out that I want to make sure that we also point to is this one right here where it says Direct Connect, okay? Now, the idea of Direct Connect is something that is neat here. It says locations allow you to establish a dedicated network from your premises to a specific AWS region. So if you're working in a hybrid environment where you still have, again, on-premise type of equipment, and you want to make sure that you have a dedicated connection up to your AWS instance, you use this, which is called Direct Connect in AWS, okay? So notice that we're not actually said, here's the way that you have to configure it all, okay? What they're actually saying is, we'll show you how that configuration works. You just have to answer these questions. You'll walk through it, and that will also provide that type of connection for you too, okay? Last little service that I want to actually do here in terms of infrastructure as a service is everybody actually needs to be able to use what names on their network, right? Unless, Vaughn, you want to memorize IP addresses for every device that you end up using. Nobody does. Well, for us in networking, that's called what? DNS, right? Domain name system or name service, depending on how old you are in this particular business here. But domain name system in AWS, they say, hey, that's actually called Route 53. So they actually take that, and this is where, Vaughn, I can set up my own DNS management, okay, is what I can do. So notice all those are actually infrastructure services that I'm setting up, but just for me as a tenant inside of AWS. It's not affecting any other customer out there, but these are all of the things that I'm actually setting up. So Vaughn, at this point, right, we've actually done some of this stuff here. There's that infrastructure, okay, a software that we talked about, operating systems where you're building that, and that all goes to actually helping us to utilize the resources that AWS has actually put right here. So this is how we are starting to actually say we're responsible for making sure, and this actually provides for us that ability to say we want more control of these devices instead of letting AWS actually manage and do all the stuff here. We're saying that we're going to take control of it as well. So this gives us the most control that we have in terms of a model when we start working with the cloud, okay? So Vaughn, that is just one of the 3 different service models that we have. So we still have to go over the platform as a service and software as a service model, and we'll show demonstrations of that as well. But right here, Vaughn, I think that that's a good place and a good kind of summary of what infrastructure as a service gives to us.
All right, that sounds great. I do have one question.
Sure.
The demo that we just went through with the AWS, you're just using that to show us what is possible, because this is a Cisco exam, so they're not going to ask you things on the AWS.
No.
But the idea of that diagram of where we have the responsibility and what the names are, those are the things that we need to be concentrating on. You're just showing us a real world example.
Yeah, and that's because you're going to see that nobody called, I say nobody, some people will call them exactly those names, like the idea of abstraction and pooling, you know, and partitioning. But nobody does that because people don't know what that term really means. But you can understand compute means what? A computer, okay? You can understand the idea here of pooling as actually being their storage services of some sort, okay? You can, pooling services. You can actually understand the idea of abstraction as being networking. So they actually kind of, you know, group them together, which makes more logical sense for, well, customers is what it does.
And Cisco will have their own way of labeling their cloud infrastructures and everything.
Right, yeah, and it'll be more technically labeled in terms of Cisco, but at least for this part here, this is more than likely what you encounter. You know, in AWS, like I said, you're not going to get away from it. If you're already looking at the cloud, more than likely at some point in your future, you're going to learn that. But right now, stick with the Cisco stuff if you're trying to achieve this certification.
All right, well, great. Thank you for that clarification, Ronnie, and thank you all for joining us. But we're going to go ahead and sign out for IT Pro TV. I've been your host, Vaughn Smith.
And I'm Ronnie Wong.
We will see you soon.
Thank you for watching IT Pro TV.